Well, there's no official family photo on the schedule for this year's G20 summit, which will wrap later Wednesday. That's just one indication of how much the war in Ukraine has complicated global cooperation efforts. Without directly naming Russia, Xi Jinping says the threat or use of nuclear weapons is unacceptable. Similarly subtle, Narendra Modi called for a ceasefire. And then in a more open condemnation, Western leaders say that Russia is the only nation capable of putting an end to the war. Still, the group has largely failed to put up a unified front. So for more on the diplomatic situation, geopolitics professor Yves Doutriaux joins us on set. He is the former deputy spokesperson of the French Foreign Affairs Ministry and also France's former deputy UN representative. Professor, thank you very much for joining us this morning.
Good morning.
So as I was saying, ahead of the G20, Joe Biden and Xi Jinping did condemn nuclear threats. This is obviously thinly veiled at Russia since Ukraine hasn't made any nuclear threats. Do you see this as a change or an evolution in China's stance on the war?
Regarding nuclear threats, it's not a change. And by the way, before the Russian invasion last February, the G5, meaning Russia, US, UK, France, and China, released a communiqué last January explaining that the nuclear threat should never be used and a nuclear war would be not admissible. So it's just the repetition of what was said officially, including by Russia, before the invasion. But to repeat it today at the G20 in Bali is very much welcome, having in mind all the threats coming from Moscow over the last months, particularly from the former president Medvedev, speaking on a regular basis on the fact that Russia is holding nuclear capacities and that could be used in case of so-and-so. So that creates a lot of uncertainties and worriness among the world. And it's not only China recalling that nuclear threat should not be used, but it's the entire world. And the G20, the group of the 20 countries, not 20, I would say 19 countries, because as you may know, Putin was not there. A couple of months ago, there were rumors that, not only rumors, but fact that the United States were trying to go to Indonesia in order that Indonesia, the host country, would not invite Russia and Putin. But it was Putin at the end who decided last week not to go to Bali for obvious reasons. He is aware of the fact that most of the world is against that war, so that he would be totally isolated. So he preferred not to be confronted to that isolation in Bali.
G20 is not necessarily a security forum. It's typically more based on economic issues, but it's obviously dominating the agenda this time. Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, though, said that the UN has failed as a multilateral institution, suggesting that more pressure should be put on the G20. Do you think that there's any room for either of them, either the UN or the G20, to actually make a difference in the outcome of the war at this point?
At the UN, you have the Security Council. And by the way, India is not part of the Security Council, even though France would like India to be a permanent member of the Security Council. So you can understand the reaction of Modi about that, about the UN. And the UN are not efficient. Why? Because of the Russian veto in the Security Council. So we have to use other channel, and G20 obviously could be such a channel, even though, as you said, at the beginning, the G20 was there to deal with, economic issue, the subprime crisis of 2008, and today the ending of the pandemic, climate change, the international trade. These are the traditional topics of the G20. But this year is very special, and it's obvious that the case of Ukraine cannot be hidden, and it was an opportunity for the world to recall its appeal for peace and the end of that war. And the responsibility of that war are very clear, even though India and China, as well as South Africa, the three countries member of the G20, abstain in the UN when speaking about the condemnation of the Russian aggression in Ukraine. They abstained, but they didn't support such an aggression. And that's a message for from the G19. All the countries are for peace and are calling for peace in order to restore peace in the world, because you don't have economic prosperity without peace, obviously. So it's interconnected, the economic and the politics.
I want to tail end off of what you said, because today, of course, is the last day of the summit, and there are two different statements coming out of this summit. One is the draft final communique, which all members agree on, saying that the war in Ukraine is hurting the global economy and nothing more. There's also a separate leaders' declaration that's much stronger. It deplores in the strongest terms Russian aggression against Ukraine. Does this suggest that the divisions between the countries on responsibility for this war are still too strong to have the G20 see a united front, or at least the G19 see a united front against Russia? It's
a rather unusual practice in the G20, because this time you have such a declaration, but in that declaration it's not a consensual 100% consensus, because you have one paragraph of condemnation and beginning by most of the leaders of the G20. It means it's not all. And there is even an allusion that there is no consensus on such condemnation or even on sanctions against Russia. But the rest of the declaration is consensual in the call for peace, and the fact that the use of threats of nuclear weapons should not be admissible. So it's unusual, but it was, I would say, expected, because we know that the positions of India, China and South Africa are not the same as the other members. We have seen that at the General Assembly of the UN. But what we are working, and Macron met President Xi Jinping as well as Modi, we count on these two countries and perhaps others in order to play a role versus, if I may say so, Russia, in order to convince Russia to stop the war. And Macron, by the way, said as well yesterday, I think, that he is going to speak on the phone to Putin. So we need to maintain the links, even though even Macron has been criticized sometimes in the West while speaking to Putin. But if you wish to do peace, we have to be two. I mean, Ukraine and Russia. You know, we used to say that to dance tango, you need to be two. It's the same. If we need to do peace, we need to be two. So we will have to speak, I would not say Putin, but Russia, because Russia is obviously a key player because Russia was the aggressor.
Professor, I think that's unfortunately all we have time for. There are so many other things to say about this summit, but we'll have to save it for another day. You have to wait for another day. Thank you very much for coming on the show today.
It was my pleasure.